Chapter 1. The Performance of Propriety. The Earl of Blackwood had never considered himself a cruel man. Cruelty required emotion, investment, the expenditure of energy on something beyond oneself, and Julian Vane possessed none of these inclinations toward his wife. What he offered instead was something far more devastating: absolute, impenetrable indifference wrapped in flawless physical possession. At 32, Julian commanded attention in every room he entered. His looks were the kind poets wasted ink describing: dark hair that fell just so across a brow made for brooding, eyes the color of smoke before a storm, a mouth that promised sins the church had not yet named. His reputation preceded him like the scent of expensive tobacco and darker pleasures. A man who took what he wanted, when he wanted it, and discarded the rest with aristocratic efficiency. The ton whispered about him with that particular breathlessness reserved for dangerous men of title and fortune. Lord Blackwood, they said, was cold as January frost and twice as unforgiving. His business dealings were ruthless. His political maneuvering, surgical. His private life, the subject of speculation that ranged from scandalous to depraved, though no one could prove the half of what they suspected happened behind the closed doors of Blackwood House. Yet none of this power, this carefully cultivated mystique of control and dominance, had prepared him for the peculiar complications of marriage to a woman he had decided, from the very beginning, not to know. He had wed Lady Alara Vance 3 years ago in a transaction as clean and emotionless as any business arrangement he had ever concluded. She was the daughter of Baron Vance, a man whose gambling debts had exceeded his ability to maintain even the pretense of solvency. The marriage had been inevitable. Julian needed an heir, the Baron needed rescue from ruin, and Alara had been offered up like a particularly fine piece of art, valuable for her bloodline and her face, neither of which Julian had any intention of appreciating beyond their utility. That she possessed a mind sharp enough to draw blood, eyes that saw far too much, and a spine of pure steel beneath her silk gowns, these were details he had noted at their wedding and promptly dismissed. He had not married her to be understood. He had married her to be used in the most specific and limited sense of that word. Their wedding night had established the pattern that would define their marriage for 3 years. Julian had taken her with the focused intensity of a man claiming territory, wordless and thorough, ensuring she understood exactly what her purpose in his life would be. Physical release. Nothing more. When he was finished, he had withdrawn to his own chambers without a single word of tenderness or acknowledgement, leaving her in sheets that smelled of his cologne and her confusion. Since then, their marriage had existed in 2 separate spheres that never touched except in darkness. By day, they were the picture of aristocratic propriety, the Earl and Countess of Blackwood, performing their roles with flawless precision at dinners and balls, and the endless social rituals that governed their world. Julian would offer his arm. Alara would accept it with a slight, mysterious smile that gave away nothing. They would dance when protocol demanded it, his hand at her waist possessive but impersonal, her body moving in perfect synchronization with his while maintaining a distance that was more than physical. Conversations between them were brief, functional, devoid of any genuine exchange. "Will you require the carriage this afternoon? The Ashfords are hosting a dinner Friday next. Your mother has written. She expects a reply." Each interaction was a performance of marital normalcy, so convincing that society saw nothing amiss in the cold perfection of their union. But at night, the performance changed entirely. Several times a week, Julian would enter Alara's chambers without knocking, without preamble, without anything resembling romance or seduction. He would take her with an intensity that bordered on savage, his hands gripping her flesh hard enough to leave marks, his mouth claiming hers with a hunger that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with conquest. He used her body with the focused attention he gave to everything he wished to master, learning every response, every place that made her gasp or arch or shudder beneath him. And Alara, for 3 years, had accepted this arrangement in silence. She never protested his nocturnal invasions, never asked for tenderness or conversation or any of the things wives supposedly craved. She simply yielded to him with a compliance that somehow never felt like submission, her body responding to his touch with an intensity that matched his own, even as her eyes remained distant, watching him from some interior place he could not reach and did not want to. This was the arrangement Julian preferred. Physical satisfaction without emotional entanglement. Release without vulnerability. He could bury himself in his wife's body without risking any part of himself that mattered, could take his pleasure and walk away unchanged, untouched by anything so dangerous as genuine feeling. What Julian did not acknowledge, even to himself, was that this arrangement required constant effort. That Alara's presence in his house had become something he was aware of at all times. The rustle of her skirts in distant corridors, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in rooms she had vacated, the knowledge that she was reading in the library or walking in the gardens or existing somewhere within the walls of Blackwood House like a riddle he refused to solve. He had trained himself not to be curious about her, not to wonder what she thought about during their silent dinners, or what she did with her days, or whether the sounds she made when he took her were genuine or performed. Curiosity meant interest, and interest meant vulnerability, and Julian Vane had built his entire identity on remaining invulnerable. The morning everything changed began like any other autumn morning in Yorkshire. Julian rose at dawn, as always, dealt with correspondence from his solicitors and estate managers, and appeared at breakfast precisely at 8 to find Alara already seated, as she always was, dressed in a morning gown of deep emerald that he absolutely did not notice brought out the gold in her unusual eyes. "Good morning," he said, the words automatic, empty of meaning. "Good morning, my lord," she replied, her voice carrying that particular quality he had long since stopped trying to interpret, neither warm nor cold, simply present, like the air itself. They ate in the kind of silence that had become comfortable through repetition. Julian reviewed correspondence. Alara appeared to be reading a letter of her own, though he did not ask from whom. They had perfected the art of sharing space while remaining entirely separate, two people performing the choreography of marriage without any of its substance. It was only as Julian was preparing to leave for his morning ride that Alara spoke again, her voice carrying a note of something he could not quite identify. "Julian." His Christian name in her mouth was so unexpected that his eyes lifted from the document he had been pretending to read. She was looking at him directly, those peculiar amber gold eyes holding his with an intensity that made something uncomfortable shift in his chest. "Yes." For a moment, the briefest moment, he saw something flicker across her face. Determination, perhaps, or resignation, or something more dangerous that he did not want to name. Then she smiled, and the expression was so strange, so unlike her usual careful neutrality, that he felt an instinctive warning pulse through him. "Nothing," she said finally, that strange smile still playing at her lips. "I simply wanted to say your name aloud. I realized I have not done so in some time. It felt significant." Before he could respond, before he could ask what the devil she meant by that cryptic statement, she rose from the table with that particular grace she possessed, the kind that made men stop and stare despite themselves. "If you will excuse me, my lord, I have matters to attend to." She left without waiting for his dismissal, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded, though Julian did not recognize it, like a decision being made. He stood alone in the breakfast room, staring at her abandoned teacup, feeling something like unease coiling in his gut. That smile, the way she had said his name. There had been something final about it, something that suggested endings rather than beginnings. But Julian pushed the thought away with the ease of long practice. He had estate business to attend to, investments to review, a life to manage. Whatever strange mood had possessed his wife, this morning was irrelevant to his concerns. She would be here when he returned, existing in her usual quiet compliance, available when he wanted her, invisible when he did not. He departed for his ride, his mind already moving to other matters, completely unaware that Alara had just said goodbye. Chapter 2, The Art of Watching. What Julian Vane did not know, had never bothered to discover, was that his wife was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Alara had spent 3 years in a state of careful observation, learning her husband with the focused attention of a scholar studying a particularly complex text. She had cataloged his patterns, his preferences, the small tells that betrayed what he was thinking even when his face remained its usual mask of aristocratic indifference. She knew that he ran his left hand through his hair when frustrated, that his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when someone challenged him, that his eyes darkened to almost black when he was aroused. She had learned him completely, while he had learned nothing of her at all. This had been her survival strategy from the beginning. If she could not have his affection or even his basic acknowledgement of her humanity, she could at least have knowledge. Information was power, even especially for a wife with no legal rights, no financial independence, no escape from a marriage that was slowly eroding her sense of self. The girl who had arrived at Blackwood House 3 years ago, terrified and hopeful in equal measure, had been replaced by a woman who understood exactly how little she mattered to the man she had wed. That understanding had been devastating at first. She had tried, in those early months, to reach him, had attempted conversations that went nowhere, had offered observations about his work or the estate that he dismissed without consideration, had even, in one moment of desperate vulnerability, asked him directly if he felt anything for her beyond physical desire. His response had been to take her to bed with particular intensity, as if sex were the only answer to any question she might pose, and then leave without a word, as always. After that, Alara had stopped trying, but she had not stopped watching. She had watched him conduct business with ruthless efficiency, had observed the way he manipulated others with surgical precision, always knowing exactly which pressure point to apply to get what he wanted, had seen him destroy men socially and financially with the same cold calculation he brought to every aspect of his life. And she had realized something crucial. Julian's control was not natural. It was constructed, carefully maintained, a fortress built against something he feared more than he feared anything else in the world. Vulnerability. Her husband, for all his power and wealth and devastating attractiveness, was terrified of genuine feeling. He had built his entire life around avoiding emotional connection, around maintaining absolute control over himself and everyone around him. The cold indifference he showed her was not cruelty. It was self-protection taken to pathological extremes. This knowledge had given Alara something she had been desperately lacking: perspective. She was not insufficient. She was not unworthy of love or attention or basic human consideration. She was simply married to a man so damaged, so fundamentally broken in some essential way, that he literally could not allow himself to see her as anything more than a body to be used when convenient. The realization had been both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it meant his neglect was not her failure. Devastating because it meant nothing she could do would ever reach him. He had locked himself away so completely that she might spend her entire life rattling the bars of his self-imposed prison without ever gaining entry. And so, 18 months ago, Alara had begun to plan. Not escape, not at first. Simply, options. She had started paying closer attention to the documents Julian left carelessly scattered in his study, had begun cultivating relationships with certain members of society who possessed information or resources that might prove useful, had carefully, methodically, begun to build a life separate from her husband, one he knew nothing about because he had never bothered to ask. The turning point had come 6 months ago, when Silas Thorne had returned to London. Silas was everything Julian was not: warm, expressive, openly interested in the world beyond his own immediate concerns. An explorer and adventurer who had spent years traveling through exotic lands, he possessed the kind of charisma that drew people to him like moths to flame. He was also, Alara had quickly realized, utterly without moral compunction when it came to acquiring what he wanted. They had met at a dinner party where Julian had, as usual, deposited her among the other wives and disappeared to discuss business. Silas had approached her with the kind of attention she had not experienced in years: genuine curiosity, real conversation, the sense that he actually cared what she thought about things. "You're far too intelligent to be wasted on drawing-room chatter," he had said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I can see it in your eyes. You're watching everything, cataloging, analyzing. What are you looking for, Lady Blackwood?" "Escape routes," she had replied, surprising herself with her honesty. His smile had been knowing, almost predatory. "I am something of an expert in those." That conversation had led to others, carefully managed meetings where they discussed literature and philosophy and the limitations placed on women of their class. Silas had been the first person in 3 years to treat Alara as if she possessed a mind worth engaging, and she had responded to that attention like a plant turning toward sunlight. She had not been foolish enough to think he was motivated by altruism. Silas wanted something from her, information about Julian's business dealings, access to the kind of society connections that could prove useful to a man of questionable reputation. But at least he was honest about using her, which was more than she could say for her husband, who used her body while pretending she did not exist. And so they had struck a deal. Alara would provide carefully selected information about Julian's ventures, nothing that would truly harm him, but enough to give Silas leverage in his own pursuits. In exchange, Silas would help her build the financial independence necessary to leave when she was ready. This morning, after 3 years of careful planning and 6 months of active preparation, Alara was finally ready. She had funds secured in her own name, carefully hidden where Julian would never think to look. She had a cottage arranged in Cornwall, remote enough that he would not easily find her. She had letters prepared explaining her departure to those few people who might care. Her mother, long since resigned to a disappointing daughter, and perhaps Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, who had always been kind. Most importantly, she had reached the end of her capacity to live as a ghost in her own life. The breakfast conversation had been her goodbye, though Julian, predictably, had not recognized it. She had wanted to say his name one last time, to see if speaking it aloud might produce some flicker of recognition, some indication that he saw her as more than a convenient receptacle for his physical needs. His blank response had confirmed what she already knew. He did not see her. He never had. And he never would, because seeing her would require acknowledging that she mattered, and Julian Vane could not afford to let anything matter. Now, in her chambers, Alara stood before the open trunk and began the methodical work of packing. Not everything, that would be too obvious. Just essentials, items she could not bear to leave behind. The rest could rot here in this beautiful, soulless house for all she cared. She worked quickly, efficiently, her hands steady despite the hammering of her heart. This was the right choice. The only choice. 3 more years of this half-life would kill something essential in her, would turn her into the ornament Julian clearly believed she was. Better to risk uncertainty than to accept slow suffocation. As she folded an evening gown, deep crimson, the color Julian had once gripped in his fist before tearing it from her body in one of their silent encounters, she allowed herself a moment of something that felt uncomfortably close to grief. Not for Julian, who had never given her anything to mourn, but for what they might have been if he had possessed even a fraction of the courage required to be vulnerable. For the marriage that could have existed if he had been willing to offer her anything beyond physical possession. She had loved him once, or thought she had, in those first months. She had looked at his beautiful, damaged face and believed she could reach the man beneath the armor. She had been naive enough to think that patience and persistence and sheer force of will could crack through his defenses. 3 years had taught her otherwise. Love was not enough when offered to someone incapable of receiving it, and Alara had finally learned that she could not save someone who refused to acknowledge he was drowning. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her freeze, her heart suddenly in her throat. But they passed by her door without pausing, a servant, going about daily tasks, unaware that the Countess of Blackwood was preparing to vanish. Alara released a breath she had not realized she was holding and returned to her packing. By nightfall, she would be gone, and Julian would return from his estate business to find his wife's chambers empty, his bed unoccupied, his life continuing exactly as it always had, with one crucial difference. He would finally have what he had always seemed to want: absolute solitude, unmarred by the inconvenient presence of a woman who had dared to want more than he was willing to give. The thought should have brought satisfaction. Instead, as Alara folded the last garment and closed the trunk with a decisive click, she felt only a hollow ache that she refused to name as heartbreak. She was done breaking her heart over a man made of ice and carefully constructed indifference. It was time, finally, to save herself. Chapter 3: The Unraveling. Julian returned to Blackwood House as twilight painted the Yorkshire moors in shades of violet and gold, his mind occupied with the usual calculations: crop yields, investment returns, the endless mathematics of maintaining an empire built on precision and control. The day had been productive. He had dismissed an incompetent estate manager, renegotiated terms with a textile manufacturer in Leeds, and reviewed architectural plans for improvements to the southern tenant cottages. Everything had proceeded with the ordered efficiency he demanded from all aspects of his life. He had not thought about Alara once. Or rather, he had not permitted himself to think about her, which was not quite the same thing. That strange moment at breakfast, her use of his Christian name, that peculiar smile, had tried several times to resurface in his consciousness, and each time he had ruthlessly suppressed it. Whatever mood had possessed his wife was irrelevant to his concerns. The house seemed unusually quiet as he entered, though he could not have articulated why that struck him as significant. Harrison, the butler, took his coat and gloves with the usual discretion, his expression betraying nothing. "Her ladyship?" Julian asked, the question automatic, part of the routine they had established over 3 years of marriage. Harrison hesitated, and that hesitation was so uncharacteristic that Julian actually looked at the man directly. "Her ladyship departed this afternoon, my lord." "Departed," Julian repeated the word as if it were foreign. "For where? I was not aware she had calls planned." "I believe," Harrison's discomfort was palpable now, "I believe her ladyship has left Blackwood House, my lord, with her trunks." The words did not immediately penetrate. Julian stood in his own entrance hall, staring at his butler, trying to process information that made no logical sense. Alara had left, with trunks, as if she were going somewhere for an extended period, as if she were. "That is absurd," Julian said flatly. "She would have informed me of any travel plans." "I do not believe her ladyship intends to return, my lord." Harrison's voice was carefully neutral, but there was something beneath the neutrality, pity, perhaps, or judgment. "She left this for you." He produced an envelope from his jacket, cream-colored paper, with Julian's name written in Alara's distinctive hand. The sight of it produced a sensation in Julian's chest that he refused to identify as panic. He took the letter without a word and walked directly to his study, ignoring Harrison's murmured inquiry about dinner. The door closed behind him with more force than he intended, the sound echoing in a room that suddenly felt too large, too empty. For several minutes, Julian simply stared at the envelope in his hands, as if looking at it long enough might change what it contained. Then, with the same deliberate control he brought to everything, he broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper within. "Julian, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I do not expect you to understand why, as understanding would require you to have noticed I existed beyond my utility to your physical needs. I have spent 3 years as an ornament in your house, a body you used when convenient and ignored otherwise. I have been compliant, silent, exactly what you seem to require. But compliance has a limit, and I have reached mine. I am not abandoning our marriage. You abandoned it the moment you decided that possession was sufficient, that taking my body in darkness absolved you of any obligation to acknowledge my humanity in daylight. You will not find me. I have made certain of that. Consider this mercy rather than cruelty. I am sparing you the inconvenience of a wife who insisted on being treated as a person rather than property. Perhaps you will not even notice my absence. After all, you never truly noticed my presence. Do not come after me." "Hey." Julian read the letter 3 times, each reading producing a different reaction. First, disbelief. This could not be real. Alara would not simply leave without warning, without discussion, without giving him the opportunity to. To what? The thought trailed off into uncomfortable territory he refused to examine. Second, anger. How dare she presume to judge him, to characterize their marriage as if she understood anything about his reasons, his choices, the careful construction of a life designed to protect them both from the dangers of genuine entanglement. Third, something that felt uncomfortably like fear. She was gone. His wife, whose presence he had trained himself not to notice, whose existence he had relegated to the margins of his consciousness, had vanished, and the house felt wrong without her in it. The silence was different, not comfortable, but oppressive. The room seemed larger, emptier, as if Alara's absence had physically altered the dimensions of Blackwood House. Julian poured himself brandy with hands that were not quite steady, downing it in one burning swallow that did nothing to quiet the chaos beginning to build in his chest. She had no right to leave. She was his wife, bound to him by law and church, and 3 years of a marriage that had functioned perfectly well until she had decided, apparently, to develop opinions about its adequacy. Except it had not functioned well, had it? The admission came unbidden, unwelcome. He had fucked her regularly, maintained the appearance of marital normalcy in public, provided her with every material comfort she could possibly require. But he had never spoken to her beyond the most basic necessities, had never asked what she thought or felt or wanted, had never offered her anything of himself beyond his body and darkness. He had used her, exactly as she said. Not cruelly, not with malice, but with a systematic indifference that was somehow worse than cruelty, because it suggested she was not even worth the energy of active mistreatment. The realization settled like lead in his stomach. Julian moved to the window, staring out at grounds that were falling into darkness, and felt something cracking in the fortress he had built around himself. Alara's letter had been surgical in its accuracy, cutting through his justifications to expose the truth he had been avoiding. He had destroyed their marriage not through neglect, but through deliberate emotional absence. He had taken everything she offered, her body, her compliance, her silent acceptance of a half-life, and given nothing in return except the cold satisfaction of his physical needs. And now she was gone. The thought produced a surge of something dark and possessive that he recognized, with distant horror, as jealousy. Not of anyone specific, she had given no indication of another man, but of her freedom itself. She had escaped his control, had removed herself from his possession, and the loss of that possession was revealing something he had not wanted to acknowledge. He wanted her back. Not because he loved her. Julian did not do love, had built his entire identity on the avoidance of such weakness, but because she was his, and he did not relinquish what belonged to him. Because the house felt wrong without her presence. Because his bed would be empty tonight, and he had grown accustomed to the weight of her body beneath his, the sounds she made when he took her, the way her eyes watched him in darkness as if seeing something he had not intended to reveal. She had called herself an ornament, but she had been wrong. Ornaments were decorative, easily replaced. Alara had become essential in ways he had refused to recognize, woven into the fabric of his daily existence so subtly that he had not noticed the pattern until she removed herself from it entirely. Julian stood at the window as full darkness fell, the brandy glass still in his hand, and made a decision that would have appalled him if he had been capable of self-examination. He would find her, he would bring her back, and he would make her understand that leaving him was not an option she was permitted to exercise. The darkness of that impulse, the possessiveness that bordered on obsession, did not trouble him. Julian had long ago accepted that he was not a good man in any conventional sense. He took what he wanted. He controlled what he possessed. And Alara, whatever she might think, was still his wife. "Do not come after me," she had written. But Julian Vane had never been particularly good at following instructions. The next 2 weeks passed in a fog of frustrated pursuit. Julian hired investigators, questioned servants, reviewed household accounts for any indication of where Alara might have gone. He discovered, to his mounting irritation, that his wife had been far more clever than he had given her credit for. She had withdrawn funds carefully over months, amounts small enough not to trigger notice but sufficient to establish independence. She had arranged transportation through intermediaries who refused to break confidence. She had covered her tracks with the thoroughness of someone who had planned this escape meticulously, who had anticipated his pursuit and taken steps to ensure its failure. The realization that she had been planning this for months, possibly years, while he had remained oblivious produced something uncomfortably close to admiration alongside his anger. Julian threw himself into the search with the same intensity he brought to business, but Alara remained frustratingly beyond his reach. It was as if she had simply vanished from England entirely, though he knew that was impossible. She was somewhere, living her life without him, and the thought produced a rage so profound he barely recognized himself. He stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping more than a few hours each night. The servants moved through Blackwood House with nervous efficiency, avoiding their masters' increasingly volatile moods. It was during this period of obsessive searching that Julian began to truly understand what he had lost. Not just a wife, not just a body in his bed, but something more essential that he lacked the vocabulary to name. The house felt dead without her, empty in ways that had nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with the absence of life, warmth, the subtle presence of another consciousness inhabiting the same walls. He found himself in rooms she had occupied, her sitting room, the library where she had spent hours reading books he had never asked about, the music room where a pianoforte sat silent and abandoned. In each space, he discovered evidence of a woman he had never bothered to know. Books on philosophy and radical politics, half-finished embroidery depicting scenes that were darkly beautiful rather than conventionally pretty sheet music for pieces that were far too complex for an amateur. Alara had been living an entire intellectual and creative life within his house, and he had never noticed, had never asked, had never cared to look beyond the surface of her compliance to see what lay beneath. The shame of that realization was sharp and unfamiliar. It was Harrison who finally provided the information Julian needed, though the butler clearly wrestled with the ethics of the revelation. "My lord," he said one evening as Julian sat in his study with yet another brandy, staring at nothing, "I perhaps should not tell you this, but I cannot watch you destroy yourself further. Her ladyship was seen in the company of Mr. Silas Thorne on several occasions before her departure. They seemed familiar." The name detonated something in Julian's chest. Silas Thorne, the explorer, the adventurer, the man with a reputation for scandal and a complete disregard for societal conventions. Julian had met him once or twice at various social gatherings and had dismissed him as irrelevant, charming but ultimately unimportant. The thought of that man's hands on Alara, his attention focused on her in ways Julian had never permitted himself, produced a jealousy so visceral it made him physically ill. "Where is Thorne now?" Julian's voice was dangerously quiet. "I believe he maintains rooms in London, my lord. Albemarle Street." Julian stood, decision crystallizing with absolute clarity. If Thorne knew where Alara was, or worse, if Thorne was with Alara, then Julian would extract that information by whatever means necessary. The possessiveness that drove him was not love. He still could not name it as such, could not acknowledge that his obsession had crossed from control into something far more dangerous and consuming. But it did not matter what he called it. What mattered was that Alara was his, and he would reclaim what belonged to him, even if he had to burn London to the ground to do it. Chapter 4. The Storm. Julian found Silas Thorne in a gentleman's club off Albemarle Street, holding court among a group of younger men who hung on his every word about expeditions to Africa and the Far East. The explorer looked exactly as Julian remembered, handsome in that easy, unstructured way that came from not caring about convention, his clothes expensive but worn carelessly, his manner suggesting he found the entire performance of civilized society faintly amusing. The sight of him produced a rage so immediate and consuming that Julian had to exercise every ounce of his considerable control, not to attack the man in public. Instead, he waited, watched. When Thorne finally excused himself and moved toward the card room, Julian intercepted him in the corridor with the smooth efficiency of a predator cutting a target from the herd. "Mr. Thorne, a word." Thorne turned, and his expression shifted from pleasant neutrality to something more cautious when he recognized Julian. "Lord Blackwood, this is unexpected." "My study, now." Julian's voice allowed for no argument. "Unless you would prefer to have this conversation here, where others might overhear matters that concern my wife." Something flickered in Thorne's eyes, guilt, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that this confrontation had been inevitable. "Very well." They walked in silence to Julian's London townhouse, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. Once inside the study, with the door firmly closed, Julian poured himself a drink he did not want and turned to face the man who might hold the key to finding Alara. "Where is she?" Thorne had the audacity to smile, leaning against the desk with infuriating casualness. "I assume you mean your wife, and I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Do not," Julian's voice dropped to something dangerous, "test my patience. I know you were seen with Alara multiple times. I know you helped her disappear, and I know that you possess information about her current whereabouts." "Even if that were true," Thorne said, his tone maddeningly calm, "why would I tell you? From what I understand, you spent 3 years treating her like a particularly convenient piece of furniture. Why should I help you find her so you can continue that treatment?" Julian moved before conscious thought could intervene, grabbing Thorne by the lapels and slamming him against the bookshelf hard enough to rattle the shelves. "Because she is my wife, and you will tell me where she is, or I will destroy you so completely you will wish you had never heard the name Blackwood." To his credit, Thorne did not flinch. Instead, he met Julian's eyes with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "There it is. That's the passion your wife never saw, the feeling you never showed her. Do you know how many times she told me she would have taken anger over indifference? That she would have welcomed your rage if it meant you actually acknowledged her existence." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Julian released Thorne and stepped back, his hands shaking with the force of his own fury and something else, something that felt horrifyingly like despair. "I acknowledged her," he said, but even to his own ears it sounded hollow. "You used her," Thorne corrected, straightening his jacket with deliberate movements. "You took her body in darkness and ignored her humanity in daylight. That's not acknowledgement, Blackwood. That's possession without responsibility. That's the behavior of a man who wants all the benefits of connection without any of its risks. You don't know anything about us, about our marriage." "I know what Alara told me." Thorne moved to pour himself a drink, his composure infuriating. "I know she spent 3 years trying to reach a man who had locked himself away so completely that she might as well have been screaming at a wall. I know she finally gave up because even the most patient heart has limits." Julian wanted to argue to defend himself, but the defense would not come, because Thorne was right. Every word he spoke was devastatingly, unbearably accurate. "Did you touch her?" The question came out raw, unguarded. "Did you?" "No." Thorne's answer was immediate, and Julian heard the truth in it. "Whatever you think happened between us, you're wrong. Alara hired me to help her disappear, nothing more. She paid me with information about your business dealings, which I might add only proves how little attention you paid to her. She had access to everything, Blackwood. Every document, every correspondence. She could have destroyed you financially if she had wanted to." The revelation should have produced anger. Instead, Julian felt something closer to awe. Alara had possessed the power to ruin him and had chosen not to use it. She had taken only what she needed to escape and left the rest untouched. Even in leaving, she had been merciful. "Where is she?" Julian asked again, but this time the demand had become a plea. Thorne studied him for a long moment, as if weighing something. Finally, he sighed. "Cornwall. There's a cottage near the coast, isolated, difficult to reach. She chose it specifically because she knew you would never think to look there, too remote, too uncomfortable for a man of your refined tastes." "Give me the direction." "On one condition." Thorne set down his glass and met Julian's eyes directly. "If you go to her, if you find her and she still refuses you, you will leave her alone. You will grant her whatever separation she requests. You will not use your power or position to force her back into a marriage that was killing her. Do I have your word?" Every instinct Julian possessed rebelled against that condition. The idea of leaving Alara free, of allowing her to exist beyond his control, went against everything he had built his life on. But he found himself nodding because the alternative, never seeing her again, never having the chance to. To what? Apologize? Explain? Win her back? "You have my word." Thorne wrote out the direction on a slip of paper and handed it over. "For what it's worth, Blackwood, I hope you've changed. Because the man Alara described to me was not worth the extraordinary woman he married." Julian left without responding, the paper clutched in his hand like salvation or damnation. He was not certain which. The journey to Cornwall took 2 days through increasingly wild country, the roads deteriorating from well-maintained thoroughfares to rutted tracks that threatened to break his carriage's axles. Julian traveled alone, dismissing his driver at the last coaching inn and continuing on horseback for the final miles. The cottage appeared as twilight fell, a small stone structure perched on cliffs overlooking the sea. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the windows, and the sight of those signs of habitation made Julian's heart hammer in his chest. She was here. After 2 weeks of searching, of obsessing, of slowly unraveling as he confronted what he had done to their marriage, Alara was here. He dismounted and approached the cottage with none of his usual confidence, feeling strangely like an intruder. Which, he supposed, he was. This was her sanctuary, her escape from him, and he was invading it because he could not accept the loss of what he had never properly valued. Before he could knock, the door opened. Alara stood in the threshold, backlit by warm firelight, wearing a simple dress of dark blue wool with her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had never seen. She looked different here, younger somehow, more herself, as if removing herself from Blackwood House had allowed her to inhabit her own skin more fully. She also looked entirely unsurprised to see him. "I knew you would find me eventually," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Julian Vane does not relinquish possession easily." "May I come in?" The request felt foreign in his mouth, this asking for permission rather than taking what he wanted. She studied him for a long moment, then stepped back. "I suppose we need to have this conversation eventually. Though I warn you now, if you think you can simply drag me back to Yorkshire through force of will, you will be disappointed." The cottage interior was sparse but comfortable, a single room with a fireplace, a bed in the corner, a small table with evidence of a simple meal. Books were stacked everywhere, on the table, the windowsill, beside the bed. Alara's refuge looked nothing like the elegant chambers she had occupied at Blackwood House. It looked lived in, real. "I'm not here to drag you anywhere," Julian said, though even as he spoke he was not certain that was true. The possessive need to simply take her, throw her over his horse, and carry her back to where she belonged still pulsed beneath his skin like fever. "I came to talk." "Talk." She moved to stand by the fireplace, putting distance between them. "That would be a novelty. In 3 years of marriage, I don't believe we've ever had an actual conversation." "Whose fault is that?" The defensiveness came automatically, but even as he said it, Julian knew the answer. "Yours." Alara's voice was steady, certain. "Entirely, completely yours. I tried, Julian. For over a year I tried to reach you. I attempted conversation, companionship, even simple friendship. And you responded to every attempt with such systematic coldness that I finally understood you didn't want a wife. You wanted a convenient body with no inconvenient humanity attached." The accuracy of her assessment was devastating. Julian moved to the window, staring out at the darkening sea, trying to find words for things he had never learned to articulate. "I read your letter," he began slowly. "You called yourself an ornament, property. You accused me of taking your body while ignoring your humanity." "Because it's true." Yes, the admission cost him, but he forced it out. "It is true, all of it. I used you abominably, Alara. I treated you as if you existed solely for my convenience, as if your only value was physical availability. I never asked what you thought or felt or wanted. I never offered you anything of myself beyond sex in darkness. I made you a ghost in your own home." She had turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" "Because I was terrified of you." The confession came from somewhere deep, a place Julian had locked away so thoroughly he had almost forgotten it existed. "From the moment we married, you terrified me." "That makes no sense. I was 19 years old, powerless, sold to you by my father like livestock. What possible threat could I have posed?" "The threat of mattering." Julian turned from the window to face her directly. "I built my entire life on control, on never allowing anyone or anything to have power over me. Emotions are weakness. Attachment is vulnerability. I learned that young and I structured everything around avoiding it. Then I married you and you were. You were everything I had trained myself not to want. Beautiful, yes, but that I could have handled. Beauty is easy to resist if you try hard enough. But you were also intelligent, perceptive, kind in ways I had forgotten existed. And every time you tried to reach me, every time you offered warmth or companionship or simple human connection, I felt my control slipping. So you retreated further." "I reinforced the walls," he confirmed. "I made myself colder, more distant, more determinedly indifferent, because the alternative, allowing you in, acknowledging that you mattered, was unthinkable. If you mattered, you could hurt me. If I cared about you, I would be vulnerable to your loss. And I had built my entire identity on being invulnerable." Alara was staring at him with an expression he could not fully interpret. Anger still, yes, but also something that might have been understanding beginning to dawn. "So you chose to hurt me instead." "I chose to protect myself," Julian said, "which amounted to the same thing. I see that now. Every night I took your body while refusing to acknowledge your humanity was a kind of violence, wasn't it? Not physical, but devastating nonetheless." "Yes," her voice broke slightly on the word. "You have no idea what it does to a person, being desired physically while being rejected emotionally. To have someone touch you with such intensity in darkness, and then look through you as if you don't exist in daylight. It made me feel insane, Julian. Like I was somehow imagining the connection that seemed to exist when you were inside me." The rawness of her words struck him like a physical blow. Julian moved closer, needing her to see his face, to understand that he was finally being honest. "You weren't imagining it," he said quietly. "The connection was real. I felt it every time I touched you, and it terrified me so completely that I could not acknowledge it. I told myself it was just physical desire, just the satisfaction of biological needs. But it was never just that, Alara. You got under my skin in ways I had sworn I would never allow anyone to do. And yet you couldn't bring yourself to speak to me like a human being." "No, because speaking to you, really talking to you, would have meant admitting you mattered. Would have meant opening myself to all the feelings I had spent my adult life avoiding. So I did what I always do. I controlled the situation by limiting its scope. I could take your body because that felt manageable. But I couldn't risk your mind, your heart, your soul, because those things required vulnerability I did not possess." Alara moved to sit in the chair by the fireplace, her movements suggesting exhaustion that was more emotional than physical. "Why are you telling me this now, Julian? Why track me down after 2 weeks just to explain what I already knew? That you're a coward who chose self-protection over basic human decency." The word stung because it was accurate. "Because living without you these past 2 weeks has been unbearable in ways I did not anticipate. Because Blackwood House feels dead without you in it. Because I have finally been forced to confront what I did to our marriage, and the realization is destroying me." "Good," her voice was hard. "You should be destroyed by it. You destroyed me first." "I know." Julian knelt before her chair, a position of humility that felt both natural and foreign. "I know what I did to you. I understand now that I took a young woman full of hope and systematically crushed that hope through 3 years of systematic indifference. I made you doubt your worth, your sanity, your value as a person. And I did it all while telling myself I was simply maintaining appropriate distance, protecting us both from the dangers of genuine feeling." Tears were sliding down Alara's face now, though her expression remained composed. "What do you want from me, Julian? Absolution? Forgiveness? The chance to do it all again?" "I want—" He stopped, forcing himself to be completely honest. I want you back, not as you were, silent, compliant, accepting whatever scraps of attention I deigned to offer. I want you back as you are now, angry, bitter, strong enough to have left me. I want the chance to learn who you actually are, to build something real instead of the hollow performance we had before. Why should I believe anything has changed? She leaned forward, her eyes searching his face. You've never cared about me before. Why would you suddenly care now just because I removed myself from your possession? Because loss clarifies things. Julian reached for her hands, and she allowed it, though her fingers remained stiff in his grasp. I did not know what you meant to me until you were gone. I had convinced myself so thoroughly that I felt nothing, that I could not recognize dependency, need, genuine attachment when it was staring me in the face. But your absence stripped away all my careful self-deceptions, Alara. I am not better for living without you. I am worse, hollowed out, obsessed, barely functional. The control I thought I was maintaining was revealed as the prison it always was. That sounds like possession, not love. It is possession, he admitted. I am not going to lie to you and claim I've suddenly become capable of the kind of selfless love poets write about. I am still fundamentally broken in ways that might never fully heal. But I am also finally willing to acknowledge that you matter to me, that you have always mattered, and that losing you has taught me that my fear of vulnerability was destroying the only thing in my life worth being vulnerable for. Alara pulled her hands free and stood, moving to the window where she stared out at the storm-dark sea. I don't know if that's enough, Julian. Even if I believe you, even if I accept that you've had some kind of revelation in my absence, I don't know if I can survive going back to Blackwood House. That place represents 3 years of slow suffocation. How do I know you won't simply revert to your old patterns once the novelty of pursuing me wears off? You don't know, Julian said, standing as well. I cannot promise perfection. I cannot swear I won't struggle with openness, with vulnerability, with all the things I have trained myself to avoid. But I can promise to try. Every day I will try to be the husband you deserved from the beginning. I will talk to you, listen to you, acknowledge your existence beyond the bedroom. I will give you power in our marriage instead of hoarding it all for myself. Power, she turned from the window, her expression skeptical. Complete power, he confirmed. If you return to me, if you give me the chance to rebuild what I destroyed, then you will set the terms. You will tell me what you need, what you require, what behaviors are acceptable and which are not. And I will follow your guidance because I have finally learned that control without connection is meaningless. I would rather be vulnerable with you than invulnerable alone. She studied him in the firelight, and Julian felt his entire future balanced on whatever she saw in his face. He had never been more exposed, more honest, more terrifyingly uncertain of the outcome. I need time, Alara said finally. I cannot simply return to Yorkshire and pretend the past 3 years did not happen. If, and this is an enormous if, I decide to try again, it will be on my terms. Completely. You will not make decisions for me. You will not assume access to my body. You will court me properly, as you should have done before we married. And the moment you retreat back into coldness, the moment you start building walls again, I am gone. Permanently this time, with legal separation if necessary. Agreed. Relief flooded through Julian, so intense it made him dizzy. Any terms you require, Alara, I will meet them all. And we begin here, she continued. Not at Blackwood House with all its associations. You will stay in Cornwall for a time. We will learn to talk to each other like adults. We will build something resembling friendship before we attempt anything more intimate. The conditions should have chafed. Julian was not accustomed to being dictated to accepting limitations on his desires. But looking at his wife, truly seeing her for perhaps the first time, he found he did not care about the restrictions. He cared only that she was willing to try, that she had not dismissed him entirely, that there was still possibility, however fragile. I will stay as long as you permit it, he said. A storm was rolling in off the sea, the wind picking up, rain beginning to patter against the windows. Alara moved to close the shutters against the weather, and Julian watched her move through her small space with a confidence she had never shown at Blackwood House. This was who she was without his oppressive presence, capable, self-possessed, comfortable in her own skin. He had nearly destroyed this woman through systematic neglect, and the fact that she was willing to give him another chance felt like grace he had not earned. You can sleep by the fire, Alara said, pulling blankets from a chest. I only have the one bed and I am not ready to share it. Not yet. Perhaps not for quite some time. I understand. And he did. Physical intimacy would need to be earned now, could not be taken as his right simply because they were married. The shift in power dynamics was both uncomfortable and strangely liberating. They prepared for sleep in careful silence, the storm building outside. Julian arranged his makeshift bed on the floor while Alara changed behind a screen, emerging in a plain nightgown that somehow seemed more intimate than any of the silk confections she had worn at Blackwood House. Just before she extinguished the lamp, she paused and looked at him. Julian. Yes. I did love you, before you taught me not to. I arrived at Blackwood House believing I could make our marriage into something real, that beneath your coldness there was a man worth reaching. I was naive, but my feelings were genuine. The past tense of that statement cut deeper than any accusation. And now? Now I don't know what I feel, she admitted. Anger, certainly, hurt, but also curiosity, perhaps, about whether you're capable of change, about whether the man giving me pretty words tonight is real or simply another manipulation. He's real, Julian said quietly. Perhaps for the first time in my adult life, I am being completely real with another person. It's terrifying, Alara, but not as terrifying as losing you was. She nodded slowly, then extinguished the lamp, plunging the cottage into darkness broken only by firelight. Good night, Julian. Good night. He lay on the hard floor, listening to the storm rage outside and his wife's breathing gradually evening into sleep. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional turbulence of the past 2 weeks, but beneath it all, Julian felt something he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. Hope. Not certainty. He had no guarantee that Alara would ultimately forgive him, that their marriage could be rebuilt into something genuine. But possibility existed now where before there had been only the hollow routine of emotional absence. She was here, and he was here, and they would try. That was more than he deserved, and everything he needed. Outside, the storm battered Cornwall with furious intensity, wind howling around the small cottage, rain lashing the windows. But inside, 2 people who had been strangers in marriage lay in careful proximity, taking the first tentative steps toward becoming something more honest. It was a beginning, not a resolution or a happily ever after, because those would need to be earned through time and consistent action. But it was a genuine beginning built on honesty rather than possession, on conscious choice rather than obligation. And for Julian Vane, Earl of Blackwood, who had spent his adult life believing that control was more valuable than connection, this fragile new start felt like the most precious thing he had ever possessed. Because Alara, against all odds and despite every reason not to, had decided to give them, the chance to discover what their marriage might become if he finally had the courage to be vulnerable. The storm raged on through the night, washing the world clean. And in a small cottage on the Cornish coast, 2 people slept with a door unlocked between them, no longer separated by walls but connected by the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of genuine feeling. It was enough. For now, it was enough.